Hello students, today we are on percents and decimals. Learning targets. I can write percentages as decimals, I can write percentages with fractions as decimals, and I can write decimals and percentages or as percentages. Just something to think about here. Think about percents and what they actually represent. Remember, percents are part of a whole or a ratio, but they're really out of 100. Okay, so remember that. Also think about our number system and what numbers to the right of the decimal represent. Those are parts. Everything to the left of the decimal is the whole, everything to the right is part. Okay, and think about how we move between numbers. So when we are taking a percent and we are trying to write it as a decimal, there's two methods that we can use. So we're going to go through both of them here. So the first method, we're looking at 7% as a decimal. So write down this step here. Okay. We can write the percent as a fraction first and then convert that fraction to a decimal. So 7%, remember percents are always out of 100. So as a fraction, that would be 7 over 100. Then convert that fraction to a decimal. So if I read that number, 7/100ths, I could then write it as a decimal with the 7 ending in the 100th place. If I read this decimal, I would read that as 7/100ths, which is equivalent to the fraction 7 over 100. So take the percent, write it as a fraction, and then convert the fraction to a decimal. That's the first method. The other method to write down here, move the decimal 2 places to the left. Add zeros if necessary. So basically what we're doing, 7 over 100, that's like doing division and dividing by 100, which is the same as moving the decimal 2 places to the left. So there's a decimal place here, even though it's not shown, and we take that decimal and we go 1, 2 spots to the left, add a decimal and a 0. So again, 7/100ths. Okay, this is just explaining we're dividing. When you divide by 100, it moves the decimal 2 places to the left. So that's 2 methods that you can use to write percents as decimals. Okay, so you try these. Pause, try writing these percents as decimals using whichever method you prefer, and then we'll go through them here. I'm going to do both methods. So 54%. So I could write that as a fraction, 54 out of 100. And then a fraction to a decimal, well, 54/100ths would be written 54 ending in the 100th place. Or if I had 54% and I moved the decimal 2 spots to the left, that would then be written like that. So both methods, either one works. Okay. Next one, I'm going to just do the decimal method because this one gets a little funky otherwise. Take the decimal place, move it 2 spots to the left, fill in the empty spot with a 0, so we would have 004. So 4 thousandths. Move the decimal 2 spots to the left. Since there's already a decimal, that's where we start. Next one, 84 2/10%. Okay. Again, I prefer just moving the decimal, especially when there's already decimals in the number like this. So I start where the decimal is, and then from there, I move 2 spots to the left. So 842 thousandths. Word problem. Alaska is the largest state, making up about 16 1/10% of the land area of the United States. Write this amount as a decimal. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to take that 1/10 and I'm going to write that part as a decimal, which would be like this. Okay, but now we got to get rid of the percent sign. To do that, move the decimal 2 spots to the left. So we would have 161 thousandths. So that's the amount of land out of all of the United States. That is just Alaska. Okay, so here's a couple more examples where we have a fraction within our percent and we need to write this as a decimal. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn that fraction into a decimal. This is kind of going back to our first lesson here. I need to get that denominator to be 10, 100, 1,000, so on and so forth. But I can multiply this by 2, and that would be 8/10. So then that would actually be 6 8/10%. And now I need to take that, move the decimal 2 spots to the left, fill in with a 0. So I would have 0.68, so 68 thousandths. That's the amount of water in the United States as a decimal. Okay, so if we have a fraction like that within our percent, I would suggest turning it into a decimal and then move the decimal place 2 spots to the left. The total area of Australia is 38 11/20% of the total area of North America. Write this amount as a decimal. So again, I'm going to turn 11/20 into a decimal. I can multiply this by 5, and I end up with 55 hundredths. So that would be 38 55 hundredths percent. Now I can move the decimal 2 spots to the left, 3855. So my answer would be 3,855 10,000ths. That's the amount Australia is to North America. Okay, so now we're going the other way when we have a decimal and we are trying to write it as a percent. So we're looking at 4/10 as a decimal. Once again, 2 methods. Have them both in your notes. The first one is to write the decimal as a fraction and then turn that into a percent, remembering that percents are always out of 100. Otherwise, move the decimal 2 places to the right and fill in with zeros and add a percent sign. Okay. So let's start with method number 1. Write it as a fraction. Well, if I read this number, I read it as 4/10, so 4/10. Now to write that as a decimal, to then turn that into a percent, percents are always out of 100, so I need to get from 10 to 100. To do that, I would multiply by 10, multiply the top by 10, which would be 40. So 40 out of 100 would be 40%. So that's the first method. The other method is to take the decimal and move it 2 spots to the right, 1, 2, fill in with a 0, and add a percent sign. This time we are multiplying by 100, which is just moving the decimal 2 places to the right. So once again, 2 methods, both of them work, whatever you prefer. Okay, so we're going to try some of these here. I'll do a little mixture of both methods. So 5/10 is the first one when I read that number. So if I put that as a fraction, which by the way, if you feel comfortable, pause and try these on your own, and then come back and watch through them. So 5/10, write it as a fraction. Again, get the fraction to be out of 100 because percents are always out of 100. So I multiply top and bottom by 10, which would be 50/100, which is 50%. So that's one of the methods. We can also just move the decimal 2 places to the right. So on this next one, 34 hundredths, move the decimal 2 spots to the right. We don't have to fill in with any zeros. We would have 34, add a percent sign though because it's asking us to write it as a percent, so percents always include a percent sign. Next one, 9 hundredths, because it ends in the hundredths place. I'm going to write that as a fraction, 9 hundredths, and that as a percent would then be 9%. And the last one here, each day Rio and his dog walk 625,000 miles. What percent of a mile do they walk? Well, I can take this and move it 2 spots, move the decimal 2 spots to the right. So it's between the 2 and the 5. So 62 5/10%. So that's what percent of a mile they walk. Okay, again, 2 different methods. You pick whichever one makes the most sense to you, and that's the one you can use. Okay, so a very nice, short, quick summary. I would write this down in my notebook. Okay, very easiest, simplest way to convert between the two. Going from a percent to a decimal, move the decimal 2 places to the left. Going from a decimal to a percent, move the decimal point 2 places to the right. And then you also need to add a percent sign. And on this one, drop the percent sign so you don't include it in your answer. Okay, so here are your 6 you try problems. You are doing these on your own in your notebook. I will be looking to see that you have these completed. So the left side there, you're turning the percent into a decimal, and then on the other side, you're turning the decimals into the percent. So make sure you have this part labeled as you do in your notebook, and then try these 6 problems and number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's all for this lesson. Look back over your notes. Make sure, do you have the title? Do you have the learning target? Vocab with definitions, examples, the problems at the end with all of the work to go with all of the examples and everything? If not, go back and add it. Check your understanding. Is this something that you could explain to somebody else? Otherwise, go back, re-watch parts of the video if you're still stuck, and try some more practice problems. You will need your notes when you're completing the pages in the packet for this unit, and also as you're doing target checks at the end. So keep your notes, and you'll also need them during the Zoom sessions.